Hey class. Over the past couple days, you've been reading several different cantos from Dante's Inferno, which is the first part of his Divine Comedy. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that we encountered in those cantos today. In particular, I wanted to talk about some of the different narrative techniques that Dante uses in these cantos, and really throughout the Inferno and the Divine Comedy. And I think that's really important to understanding a piece of literature, is really understanding how the author has constructed the literature. We talked a little bit about this already when we talked about the number 3 a few days ago, and how he structures everything around the number 3. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about some of the other narrative techniques that he uses and how we can see those techniques at work. So we're going to walk kind of canto by canto from some of the ones that you've read and talk about some of the different narrative techniques that we can see in particular in some of those cantos. So let's start with Canto 1, where we find Dante in the dark wood of error. And he sees the right path up ahead, but there's a steep hill in his way and he can't climb it, and there's these animals who keep kind of driving him back into the dark wood of error, and he can't really find his way out. And he cries out for help, and the kind of ghost, the spirit of the great Roman poet Virgil, appears to him and says basically, I can help you on your journey, and we're going to go through a journey. In order to get out of the dark wood of error, you have to journey down through hell, and then up Mount Purgatory and through paradise, and then you will be on the right path, which is essentially the path to salvation. So that's what we're encountering really in Canto 1 of the story. So let's talk a little bit about some elements, some literary elements that are introduced in Canto 1. So we talked the other day quite a bit about allegory and how the entire Divine Comedy is really an allegory for someone's spiritual journey, how they begin in sin and then come to a recognition of their sin, repent of their sin, and receive forgiveness and salvation. It's really what the whole Divine Comedy is. It's an allegory for that. And the allegory is set up in some pretty clear ways here at the beginning of the book. Dante finds himself in the dark wood of error, meaning that he is in an entanglement of sin, right? And he actually kind of describes it as he woke up in the dark wood of error, realizing kind of this allegory for the kind of spiritual awakening that happened, meaning he kind of been wandering through the dark wood of error for a long time and he didn't realize it. He'd been going on in life in sin and didn't realize it, and suddenly came to a recognition of his own sin. And so he kind of wakes up and realizes that he's lost, and then he looks about him and he sees kind of this narrow path, which is the right road, meaning the way that God intended us to be, right? The kind of life that he intended us to live. And yet he can't get to that road because of a couple things. One of those things is that the hill is very steep, right? And so this kind of symbolizes the fact that on his own effort, he's unable to get there, right? You need God's grace in order to live the way that God has called you to live. You can't do it on your own effort. So he's trying to climb up the hill on his own effort, but he can't get there by himself. He needs some sort of divine intervention. The other thing that keeps him from being able to reach the path is these 3 animals. And he describes the 3 animals, the leopard, the lion, and the she-wolf. And these, you may remember, I mentioned the other day as kind of the types of sins that he mentions in hell, right? And so this is very symbolic. He draws this out across the Inferno, the lion, the leopard, and the she-wolf, these 3 different groups of sins. So the animals here, right, when he's trying to climb up the hill and he can't because it's steep and because the animals keep chasing him back into the wood, they represent his own sins that are besetting him, right? Like he's trying to climb out of his own sin, and yet sin keeps coming and pulling him back, right? He keeps being attacked by his own sin nature, and he needs God's help. He can't defeat these animals on his own. So the animals are literally representing sin. And I mentioned this the other day, the leopard represents the sins of fraud and deceit. The lion represents the sins of pride and cruelty. And the she-wolf represents the sins of lack of self-restraint. So sins like gluttony and lust and so forth. So he's beginning to build in some very key symbols early on in this book, and he sets it up as an allegory right out of the gate. We know that this is allegorical. Even before he begins his journey into hell, we know that this is all an allegory. Now, another thing that he sets up very early on in Canto 1 is another structure that he will use throughout the whole text, which is that of dialogue. This book is very heavily dialogue-driven. So dialogue, hopefully you know this, but in case you didn't, here's the information. Dialogue is simply the term that we use in literature for conversation between characters. So when multiple characters are having a conversation. And this is a narrative structure that's been around for a long time. You may remember we talked about the structure of dialogue between master and teacher when we were talking about some Indian literature, and that is the kind of structure that Dante uses here in his work. He uses this kind of master-teacher dialogue throughout. Now, in the Inferno and in the Purgatorio, it's a conversation between Dante and Virgil, who's serving as his teacher and guide. When we get to the Paradiso, it will be a conversation between Dante and Beatrice, who serves as his guide through paradise. However, they are not exclusively the only two characters that are engaged in dialogue. You will notice that Dante frequently stops to talk to different characters, right? Different people that he meets throughout his journey. He will have conversations with them. And so dialogue is one of the major narrative techniques that Dante is relying on in writing this book. Very dialogue driven. It's all about conversations and all of the things that Dante learns, and therefore all of the lessons that we as readers are supposed to learn are learned through dialogue. So part of this dialogue structure that Dante uses is a way to show how Dante, the character Dante, has an experience, right? He has an experience, and then Virgil supplies explanations which add meaning and purpose to his journey, right? And so it's through the explanations of Virgil that Dante is able to understand his journey through hell. So that is kind of the back and forth, and that's the way the structure works. The student, Dante, asks questions about things that he doesn't understand. The teacher, Virgil, supplies explanations, and these explanations help Dante to interpret what he sees and create a sense of meaning and purpose out of his journey, and therefore an allegorical meaning and purpose for us as readers. And it's through the dialogue that Dante eventually shows his growth. All right, let's move on to Canto 3. Canto 3 is where Dante and Virgil first enter hell. They read the inscription over the gates of hell. And then as they enter, they see the souls of the non-committal. There's lots of different ways that different translations and authors describe them, but they're basically the souls of the people who didn't commit to either good or evil in their lives. They didn't make a choice for God, but they didn't necessarily make a choice against God. They just didn't commit to anything really in their lives. And so they're seen chasing this banner eternally, but they're never able to catch the banner. And they're running round and round in circles, never able to actually make any progress. And he has this whole description of them being stung by wasps and hornets and all this sort of thing. They pass by these people and they arrive at the river where Charon, the ferryman of hell, ferries souls across into hell. And at first they're denied passage, but then eventually kind of God divinely intervenes and kind of convinces somehow Charon to carry them across. Dante faints, and by the time he awakens, they're already across the river. So one of the narrative structures that Dante begins to rely very heavily on as they move into the actual journey, specifically his journey through hell, is imagery. And imagery is essentially the use of words and details to create vivid pictures in the reader's mind. And so Dante relies very heavily on this as he describes all of the very kind of physical torments that are going on in hell. And several ways that he does this is through repetition. He repeats certain things. He also appeals to the senses, our five senses. That's a very effective way to use imagery, is to use descriptions that appeal to our five senses of taste, touch, smell, sound, and sight. And also metaphors and similes can be another way of using imagery. Particularly in Canto 3, Dante uses a lot of appealing to the senses, and he uses this a lot throughout the Inferno. He appeals to the senses and describes things in quite vivid detail. And so one of the questions that I asked you to consider after reading Canto 3 was, what kind of imagery appealing to the senses does Dante use in Canto 3? So you probably have already thought about that a little bit. I want to focus on one that maybe you didn't necessarily think of because it was words, but he creates a picture surrounding the words. So one of the images that we get is the gateway to hell, right? Dante and Virgil approaching the gateway to hell, and there's the description, an image, right? Imagery of the gate. So there's this kind of yawning chasm opening up, and there is the gate rising above them, and on the gate is inscribed these words. I am the way into the city of woe. I am the way to a forgotten people. I am the way into eternal sorrow. Sacred justice moved my architect. I was raised here by divine omnipotence, primordial love, and ultimate intellect. Only those elements time cannot wear were made before me, and beyond time I stand. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. So he creates this image of this gate and this very kind of dooming, discouraging inscription above the gate. And then beyond it, you can kind of see as you're walking in all these people running around chasing this banner. It's a very dismal picture, and yet sandwiched in the middle of this is hope. So the inscription says, abandon all hope, ye who enter here. And yet Dante himself is not hopeless. In fact, it is hope that is spurring his journey on, right? So he's taking this kind of allegorical journey, but he has hope, right? And so he does not have to abandon all hope. Now that inscription is obviously meant for the people who are going into hell and never coming out. But Dante himself does not have hope. Now keep in mind this is allegorical. I don't think that this means that Dante is saying that he believes that someone who has died could go to hell and then could eventually get out of hell. I don't think he's necessarily saying that, but there is an allegorical contrast here, right? Between abandoning all hope, and yet Dante has hope, and that God offers us hope and a way out of our sins. He has offered that to us. And keeping in mind that Dante's whole story is actually an allegory for our lives here and now, right? It's not really an allegory for our lives after death. It's an allegory for our journey towards salvation here and now while we're still alive. And so while it may feel hopeless, the reality is that God has offered us a way out of sin. And I think that is captured a little bit in the middle part of this inscription. Sacred justice, holy justice, moved my architect. I was raised here by divine omnipotence, by divine power, by God's power. I was created by God's power, by his primordial love and ultimate intellect. Isn't love an interesting thing to have on the inscription of the gateway of hell? And I think there's some really interesting stuff about Dante's theology and his beliefs and how he interprets the Bible. Again, we're talking about all of this. You need to search the Bible yourselves, because remember that the Divine Comedy is not the Bible, right? And so we should not give it the same weight as the Bible. But there are some interesting thoughts here. So he says that sacred justice, God had to be just. He had to create a consequence for sin, right? So sacred justice moved my architect. we know in our souls we want punishment for wrongdoing, right? It's a natural part of our human condition. And I think part of that is divinely inspired, right? That we know that there are things wrong with the world and we want those things to be fixed. And therefore God has to punish evil. And that is why this all exists, right? It's not because God is cruel and mean. And Dante captures that in the next couple lines. God created hell in Dante's vision out of divine power and love and reason, intellect. Those are very strange things to think about in relation to God creating hell. But he created it out of love. And if you really think about it, God has created a punishment for sin and wrongdoing because he knows it destroys our lives. And so he lets us know. He's saying, look, if you do this, it's going to hurt you. And so I'm going to punish you for it because I love you and I want to give you a reason to turn away from that. Think of it as a parent with a child, right? If a child is about to reach out and touch a hot stove, the parent is going to slap their hand. They're going to give them pain to save them from pain, right? To save them from worse pain. And so God, in his love, and the parent doesn't slap the child's hand because they hate them. They slap the child's hand because they love them and they don't want the child to burn their hand, right? And they know that the sting of the slap will last far shorter than the burning of the stove. And so it's actually God's love that creates consequences for sin because he wants us to turn away from that and to find the better path. And so despite the fact that the inscription says, abandon all hope, ye who enter here, the inscription also contains the hope that God offers to us, the love of God, and that is the way out of sin. So hopefully that's a really interesting image that maybe you didn't think about as much when you were thinking about the different senses when I asked you to in the question. This is a little bit different image, but I think it's a really powerful one. All right, now let's look at Canto 5. In Canto 5, Dante and Virgil enter into the circle of the lustful, where those people who did not believe in God, did not follow God, and their primary sin was the sin of lust, are being punished. And they're being blown about in an eternal wind. And they stop and talk to two particular souls, Francesca and Paolo. Francesca tells their story, but they're kind of bound together. And it's kind of this eternal, like, they were lustful after one another in life, and now they can never be separated, which if you kind of think about, like, what if you wanted to be separated from somebody, you wanted some space, and you never can be again, right? It's kind of a kind of thing. So one of the techniques that Dante uses when he starts writing about the journey through hell is the technique of cause and effect. And as a quick reminder, cause is what makes something happen, and the effect is what happens, right? Pretty simple. It's a very simple idea, but it's a very common technique that authors use to create structure in a piece of literature. So Dante uses this here in his journey through hell as he paints an effect for every sin that was committed, right? So the people committed this sin, and this is the consequence. Now, again, this is an allegory. So I don't think that Dante is saying, oh, when you die, if this was your primary sin, this is what you will actually suffer. No, he's not trying to say that because he's not claiming he's actually seen hell. What he's setting up here is an idea. It's a physical representation of what kind of happens on a spiritual level when you get caught in this sin in real life while you're still alive, right? And so these are he's kind of portraying the natural consequences of sin in our soul, and he's giving a physical reality to them. So remember, we talked about allegory makes the non-physical physical, right? And so he's taking what happens in our souls and creating a physical representation of that. So kind of what he's suggesting is that people who are lustful in their lives are blown about by their passions. They're never committed to anything. They're never able to rest and be content, right? And they get attached in relationships, and then they want to get out of that relationship, but they can't. And so he's using this kind of blowing wind and the souls being stuck together to one another to create this kind of cause and effect that happens in our real lives spiritually, and he's kind of representing that physically in his book. And so the lustful in real life are constantly being blown about by their passions, and they're always jumping from one thing to the next, and they can never stay in anything, never be content, never rest, and be content in a healthy and wholesome relationship. And they're always moving on to the next person. And so that is kind of what he's accomplishing. And that's what he does throughout the Divine Comedy with cause and effect. He's kind of saying, here's the cause, and here's the spiritual result that actually goes on in your life, right? You may not be able to see it, but I'm going to help you see it by creating a physical representation of it. And he does that both in hell and in purgatory. He kind of does those things. You may have noticed that this circle is also sometimes called the circle of the carnal. That's a word that some translations of Dante use. And the word carnal comes from Latin roots. It's based on the Latin word carnalis, and it's important to understand it means flesh as opposed to the spirit. And so Dante is saying that the people in this circle are the people who are focused on the flesh, physical, sexual pleasures, over spiritual pleasures. They ignored the spiritual side of love and focused only on the physical side of love. And that's a big deal for Dante actually throughout the work. Love is the key to understanding Christ and understanding salvation. But if you only focus on the physical aspect of love, you've missed it. And he's not necessarily saying the physical aspect of love is bad, but certainly lust is wrong, right? And people who lust are people who have gotten distracted from the spiritual aspect of love and how physical love fits into that, and have begun to focus only on the physical aspect of love. So the root word carn is also the basis for a number of other English words, so you may actually understand some of these words better. Carnal, right, meaning concerned with the flesh. Carnivore, meaning one who eats flesh, or carnivorous. Carnival. Carnival, have you ever thought about that one? That is an event that is focused on the pleasures of the flesh. Interesting, and may help you understand why Christians in certain eras didn't like carnivals. I think carnivals are pretty harmless, but they were seeing that as focused only on the pleasures of the flesh. Incarcerate, to imprison one's body, to imprison one's flesh. So that's also important for understanding the kind of spiritual point that Dante is making in this canto, is to understand the actual vocabulary here. Another technique that Dante uses throughout the Inferno in particular is a number of literary allusions. He places his work in the context of a number of other literary works. And so he's writing his work, and he wants it to be seen as a part of the great tradition of literature that has come before him. And so particularly we could see this in the in Canto 3, in the Circle of the Lustful. He pulls in a lot of characters from literature and legend, and even a couple from history, who are from other texts, and he places them here as souls that are being tormented in the Circle of the Lustful. This is what we call an allusion, when an author makes a brief connection between his or her text and another text. And that's what we call a literary allusion. So some of the literary allusions that he makes, one that you'll recognize, Helen of Troy, right? Makes sense why she would be in this circle. You know, she lusted after Paris and ran off with him. So Paris is also there. Dido, who is a character from actually Virgil's epic, the Aeneid, and she she lusts after Aeneas and actually commits suicide because she's so in love with him. Achilles, probably because I think Dante might include him because Achilles got so upset over Briseis, his little girl war prize, being taken from him. There might be some other reasons why Dante includes him here. Tristan, who is from another medieval work of literature, so actually more contemporary of Dante's time. The legend of Tristan and Isolde, and Tristan is one of King Arthur's knights, but he gets caught up in kind of an affair with another man's wife, Isolde, and they end up committing suicide. It's kind of a Romeo and Juliet sort of situation. Cleopatra, you may recognize Cleopatra, of course. She was in love with Mark Antony and sided with him fighting against Caesar Augustus, and then when Mark Antony was killed, and she was sleeping with him, and she was using herself to kind of she was using her body to kind of gain political power, essentially. Anyways, when she lost the war and lost Mark Antony, she committed suicide. You can't really see the name on this last one, but Semiramis, who I believe, if I'm remembering the legend correctly, went to war because this guy that she thought was really attractive wouldn't marry her. So all characters, they're literary allusions, so connections to other pieces of literature and to history. But they all also are characters who got caught up in lust, and whose lust causes major problems for other people. Another technique that Dante really clearly uses throughout the entire Divine Comedy is that of first-person narration. And the entire story is actually told from character Dante's point of view, right? Again, keeping in mind this is not literal, but Dante uses himself as the main character, and he tells the story from his point of view using I, right? I, me, my. And so that is first person when the narrator speaks from his or her own point of view using I or me. The narrator, when we're using first-person narration, could typically be two types of people. It could be a participant in the action, or the narrator could be an observer, just kind of a person who's kind of observing what's going on. Dante is the first. This is his journey, so he is a participant in the action, although he is also observing things as well, but primarily he is a participant in his own journey. So some of the disadvantages of using first-person narration is that the narrator has to be physically present at all times in order to tell the story, and has to be involved in most of the important action. It also makes multiple points of view more challenging to write, although Dante gets around this in a very interesting way, and so we'll talk about that in a few minutes. The advantages, though, are that first-person narration creates the feeling of memoir or autobiography. It makes it feel more real to us because we're hearing the character's voice, so it feels more like a real story even when it's not. It's also why I keep warning you that this is all an allegory, because it's very easy, because Dante writes it in first person, to get caught up in, forgetting that it's an allegory. First-person narration also allows us to delve much more deeply into the character's emotions. So because we're seeing it from Dante's perspective, we really, really get an insight into his mind and what he's thinking and feeling. So first-person narration is a very popular literary technique, and it's something that has been used down through history and continues to be used today. I'll give you a few examples of it. The Hunger Games, obviously very popular trilogy. It's all narrated from Katniss's perspective. That's easy to forget if you've only seen the movies, because the movies jump back and forth between different characters' perspectives, but the book is actually told entirely from Katniss's perspective, all three of them. Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief, all told from Percy's perspective. He uses I when he's narrating. Divergent by Veronica Roth, from Triss's perspective. A couple older, more classic works, Sherlock Holmes, narrated from the perspective of Dr. Watson. So that's kind of where it's not the main character, what I was talking about. Dr. Watson actually narrates the story, and he tells the story of Sherlock Holmes. He's more of an observer than a participant. He's more just kind of on the sidelines watching what Sherlock Holmes does. Sherlock Holmes is the main focus of the stories. To Kill a Mockingbird, if you've ever read that book, narrated all from Scout Finch's point of view. So continues to be a very popular technique of storytelling. Some of the things that happen with Dante's first-person perspective in the Inferno and the Divine Comedy, one of the reasons that Dante chooses that is it really underscores the personal nature of his journey. It's really about his personal journey towards salvation. And it really is meant to reflect and be an allegory of the process that Dante underwent and the things that he came to understand on his own spiritual journey. He also uses it because it establishes a bond with the reader. So the readers see things as Dante sees them, and they accept his judgments, meaning that we're more open to the insights that Dante has to offer because we're seeing him from a first-person perspective, and we're kind of inside his mind, and so they make sense to us. One of the ways that Dante gets around some of the limitations of first-person perspective, because one of the limitations is not allowing for multiple points of view, but one of the ways he gets around that is to have different characters, different souls that he encounters on his journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise tell their own story. And so he slips into first person from their perspective a number of times. And so the first time we see this happen is Francesca and Paolo's story in The Circle of the Lustful. And Francesca tells the story. And you may recognize a couple other literary characters, another literary allusion here. The story of Lancelot and Guinevere is the book that they're reading when they realize that they love each other and they begin to have an affair. And so that's another little literary allusion there. But he gets them to tell their story. And so that gets beyond the limitations of the first-person narrator. He can have multiple points of view because he talks to people and they all tell him their story and how they ended up here. But that also allows Dante to raise another really interesting question that's worth considering, is that can first-person narrative be deceptive? And you may have recognized in your listening to the radio drama of the Inferno that at one point Dante says, well, all human beings lie to themselves at one point or another. And that's kind of getting at this same question that Dante is raising. When he hears the stories from the souls who are in hell, he hears it from their point of view. And so sometimes they may make themselves out to not really be that bad, right? And he's raising the question of, do we sometimes lie to ourselves and justify our own sin and say, oh, but it's not really that bad. It's okay. You know, my situation is different. So it's okay that I'm doing this, even though it's wrong for other people, but it's okay for me. It's okay for me to do that. And we lie to ourselves, and our first-person narratives in real life are sometimes deceiving ourselves, right? And so by having the characters tell their own stories in hell, he's kind of raising that question, can first-person narrative be deceptive? Can we even deceive ourselves? And so it's another opportunity for a spiritual point that he makes. So hopefully you guys found that brief overview of some of the narrative techniques that Dante is using helpful and informative and interesting. He continues to use a number of those narrative techniques throughout the other two books, the Purgatorio and the Paradiso. Though they take a little bit of a shift. The souls in purgatory are more willing to admit that they were wrong, which is part of why they're in purgatory, right? They recognized their sin. They didn't continue in their sin and denying the fact that they were sinning. They recognized that they were sinners, and so that they have the hope of getting to heaven someday. So, starting today, you guys are going to be listening to the BBC radio drama portion of the Purgatorio. So I'm going to give a little bit more instructions there, and there will be some instructions for response and discussion with one another in response to the Purgatorio. But you guys can get started on that. That will be uploaded, and I hope you enjoy listening to it. It's just as well done as the next, and has a very different tone, and there's a lot of really good lessons to learn in there as well. So I think you guys will find that pretty interesting and hopefully a little bit inspiring too. All right, guys, have a great day and contact me if you have any questions.